they're invisible in Washington, uncounted by the official unemployment numbers you hear on television, and yet they're everywhere. Americans who have dropped out of the workforce, workers who don't work. An ever-increasing percentage of these are male. About 7 million American men between the ages of 25 and 54 no longer have jobs. That's more than 10% of the entire prime-age male labor force in the United States. It's a huge number. Most of those men, studies predict, will never return to work. What happened? Well, some of the causes are well known. Competition from foreign manufacturers crushed our country's industrial sector. China's entry into the WTO alone destroyed more than 2 million American jobs. Automation is killing many more. A disproportionate number of these jobs are in traditionally male industries: manufacturing, agriculture, logging. A 2016 McKinsey report found that, quote, 90% of what welders, cutters, solderers, and brazers do could be replaced by robots, and soon. Jobs in which women are the majority tend to be far less vulnerable to automation. 3 of the 5 fastest-growing professions are dominated by women. The jobs that remain for men tend to pay less than the ones that disappeared. This is especially true for working-class men who, unlike their female counterparts, have seen their real wages fall over time. And part of the reason for that is mass immigration. More than 1 million new immigrants enter this country every year legally. A large but unknown number come illegally. Most of these are low-skilled. All of them are looking for work. These new rivals compete primarily with the very Americans most likely to have lost their jobs. And the effect is lower wages. It's a matter of supply and demand. An overabundance of anything makes it cheaper, and that goes for labor. One study conducted after the Mariel boat lift in Florida found that Americans with lower education levels in Miami, the most vulnerable, saw their wages fall by 37% after the immigrants arrived. Policymakers didn't seem to notice, and they still don't, probably because it doesn't affect them. If waves of immigrants from the third world are becoming lawyers and nonprofit executives and members of Congress, how long would the border stay open? Meanwhile, millions of American men now make less than their fathers did. That's a tragedy. It's a betrayal of the American dream. But it's also a recipe for societal collapse. When men's wages decline, families fall apart. This fact is well known to researchers. It's been the subject of many studies over decades with consistent results. And yet it's rarely noted in public. Here's some of what we know. One well-regarded study released last year found that when men's wages fell relative to women's, families didn't form. According to the authors, a falling male wage reduced, quote, the attractiveness of men as potential spouses, thus reducing fertility and especially marriage rates. Researchers also noted a dramatic increase in out-of-wedlock births when men made less. In the words of one of the authors, an economics professor at MIT, quote, we see a decline in fertility, a decline in marriage, but a rise in the fraction of births that are disadvantaged. As a consequence, the kids are living in pretty tough circumstances. Numerous academic studies have reached the very same conclusion. Research from 2015 found that, quote, when a randomly chosen woman becomes more likely to earn more than a randomly chosen man, marriage rates decline. Those who do marry report being less satisfied and are more likely to divorce. Low male wages are a driving force in family dissolution, and that's why affluent neighborhoods in which men make more have a higher proportion of married couples and fewer divorces. The opposite is also true, and that leads to a cascade of social problems, which over time become a disaster. Men who make lower wages marry less and father more children out of wedlock. These children growing up without fathers tend to make lower wages themselves in later life. For decades, this was a universally recognized pattern in inner cities, the cycle of poverty. Much was written about it. Now the same destructive vortex is common in rural America. The cause isn't culture, that's what we thought. No, in both cases the cause is the same, a lack of well-paying jobs for men. What's striking is how little notice these facts get from our policymakers. Their overriding aim is to raise women's wages to parity or above men's. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but these are complex questions with numerous and profound unintended consequences, so they deserve a vigorous public debate. It's notable that most women, the very population on whose behalf these policies are supposedly devised, strongly prefer to marry men who make more than they do. But what's beyond debate is that Washington and corporate America aren't thinking a lot about how to solve the male wage crisis. If anything, they're exacerbating it. Lawmakers in both parties, for example, have heartily embraced self-driving vehicles and drone delivery of packages. It's all impressive technology, but what would be the effect on employment? Has anyone asked that? There are more than 3 million professional truck drivers in this country. It is the most common job in the majority of American states. More than 90% of drivers are men. Thanks to technology, many of these men are about to lose their jobs. That's a lot of unemployed Americans. That's a lot of broken families. Washington is not worried at all about this. Lawmakers and business leaders assure us that those truck drivers will be just fine. They'll find something else to do, something better, in fact, with higher pay. And maybe they will. But keep in mind, our leaders said the very same thing about manufacturing jobs 30 years ago.
David Paul Kuhn is a political analyst. He's the author of What Makes It Worthy. He's done a lot of research on this subject, and we're happy to have him tonight. David, thanks for coming on. It's clear that there is a male employment and wage crisis, and it's clear that that is driving family dissolution in the middle of the country, which is why we're seeing the same social pathologies in rural America that we once associated with cities. It's about wages. It's pretty clear from the data. Why aren't our policymakers responding to this?
I mean, I think, first of all, we have to agree that it's a crisis. Imagine 90 Lambeau Fields, 90 stadiums full of men missing in action from our workforce, and we'll have a concept of the problem. And so obviously this has a terrible effect on men. Men are far more likely to want to work, and therefore they're far more likely to be depressed when things aren't working out. And if we can at least agree on those basic facts, which we know from myriad studies, I think it's a good starting place.
But there seems to be resistance on the part of policymakers even to acknowledging the problem, as if, and this is just a guess, it is somehow an attack on women to acknowledge that there is a male employment crisis. Politics seem to play a role.
They definitely plays a role, and so does our culture. And of course, that's silly, as you would note. Obviously, you can care about women and you can care about men. It's not either or. And feminism taught us that what hurts one sex hurts us all. That applies to women, but it certainly also applies to men. So there's a particular working, especially blue-collar crisis among men. And if we can at least, perhaps, take some of the gender politics, ironically, out of a discussion about what's happening to men, perhaps we can start to treat them as people.
But why have we gone, I mean, the conversation appears to have moved from what you just said, an acknowledgement that the sexes are interrelated, dependent on each other, thrive only when each is thriving, to a kind of zero-sum understanding where my loss is your gain and vice versa. When did that change?
I mean, you could argue it probably changed with second-wave feminism in the 1970s, but that's a long time ago. It's a half-century ago nearly. And I would just say, obviously, it is true that it's still politically incorrect to talk about the crisis among men. If you read, unfortunately, if you read a lot of liberal publications, they'll put the word crisis in quotes as if it's not real. Can you imagine if we applied that to other groups that were experiencing unique downsides of our economy? So we have a crisis, and I think that if we can get past, again, the hardest part is getting past the politics and just acknowledging that it's affecting families and men, and that it increases the rates of depression in these men, divorce. They go to church less, they certainly remove themselves from society, and it's just a downward cycle, and it increases the chances of drug use, and they watch more television. It's just a dire situation that we have to take very seriously.
Well, and in general, there's a reluctance to have serious conversations about economic questions from either side. I'm not espousing a position. I'm just saying they're never debated anymore in favor of this frivolous, symbolic stuff. But quickly, there is technology right on the horizon that will displace millions of American workers, disproportionately men, self-driving cars, drones. I never hear the implications of that for employment mentioned by anybody. Why is that?
Because it's treated like a natural disaster. And it's been treated like a natural disaster for decades, and it's infuriating. Because, of course, automation, deindustrialization were major factors in this blue-collar crisis, and this blue-collar male crisis particularly. But man-made decisions impacted this crisis, and they still do. And so as we move forward with automation, we have to consider, unfortunately, I don't think our elites do, the downside of the supposed good it will bring.
That is exactly right. I mean, they treat market capitalism like a religion rather than a useful economic system, which it is. But we can't do anything. It's inexorable.
That's
like
right,
a natural
and it's unfortunately
disaster.
true on both sides.
It is true on both sides. David, thank you. That was really wise. I appreciate it.
Thank you.